So what I'm going to be talking about today is the idea of evil Thelema, and I want to take that from sort of a practical, more of a philosophical concept of what the role that evil plays in the sort of system, where we find it, and take that to a more ethical place, look at how it might guide our actions, and then more to a practical place to talk a little bit about demonology and that sort of magical implications of those ideas. So this idea is important because basically, like, pretty much every belief system has to reckon with this idea of evil in some way, in some perspective, at some time. And we have a very specific idea of what this kind of means in Thelema, and it sort of comes to as a solution to a problem that Crowley sees, where he identifies basically the cause for people to seek out religious ideas in a lot of cases is through some experience of suffering. And this becomes problematic for a lot of people because, you know, we are hardwired to find meaning in the events that take place for us. So if we have an experience of suffering, we go through something bad, we want to ascribe that to something. And this is where you get a lot of people's sort of misplaced notions about karma, misplaced notions about reward punishment systems, the idea like if I'm bad to other people, something bad's going to happen to me, which is on the face of it a ridiculous idea. If that was very true, if that was actually true, then the world that we live in would look a lot different than the world that we actually do live in. Where the reality is, good things happen to bad people, bad things happen to good people, and it doesn't have the sort of consequence. This is where Crowley borrows a lot from Nietzsche's ideas, where he's talking about sort of that this system is a method of control. It's not really a way of answering the problem, it's a way of delaying the problem. And we see that in the Christian paradigm where we have an afterlife. So, you know, you're good, you're nice to everyone, and then, you know, it may suck during your life, and people may take advantage of you and use you and walk all over you, but then after you die, it's great because they're going to be punished and you're going to paradise, which works out conveniently because it doesn't happen until after you die. There's really no one who came back and told us about it. And so, like, this is interesting. I think that the idea, we have to look at the difference between a reward-punishment model of the idea of evil and a cause-effect model of the idea of evil. And Crowley is very much about a cause-effect model. In Liber 5, in his notes on Reguli, he says that you know, evil is error. And like this idea to have evil as a positive sense of something that's like doing something for evil ends or evil purposes, he says that's fatal to philosophy. We can't have that. So what we have is evil is more like something in the wrong place at the wrong time. The analogy he uses is scuba gear would be good if you're swimming in the ocean, but evil if you're trying to walk across the desert. And it's no more or less complicated than that. At the same time, this has implications for the philosophy of Thelema, and particularly in ceremonial magic, to the entities that we deal with. You know, there's systems to deal with angels and systems to deal with demons. So, you know, if we have this, we don't have this sort of ultimate idea of evil in this positive sense of creating something. Well, what does that imply to us about these entities? What that might mean about our interactions with them? And I think that it always has to come back to causality, and this is what the link is to magic. I mean, Crowley tells us that ceremonial magic is creating change in conformity with our will. And that change, if you have a successful ceremonial magical ritual, doesn't generally come about through obviously supernatural means. I mean, just to take a perfectly mundane example, you know, if I do a ritual for a new job, but I sit around at home and don't apply for jobs and wait for a job to just fall in my lap, it's going to be a lot harder for that to happen than if I'm like out there actually working to make that happen. And then you have to provide a path for cause and effect to manifest itself in that respect. You know, I've had very successful workings with demons, but I've never had anything pop up out of nowhere, just out of thin air. You know, it's always there's a system of coincidences that come down, or a certain set of circumstances that take place, which allow the thing that I did the ritual to manifest to actually come into being. So that's a difference. Then when this sort of radicalizes our notion of suffering, which is the whole point behind this. If we're suffering because it's beautiful and necessary and it's a part of our initiation or our incarnation, we have to learn these lessons and go through these things, and that gives kind of a meaning to it, which means that it's not necessarily something to be rejected or treated as, you know, if we run from suffering, and this brings us back to Nietzsche, where he points out very clearly, if we run away from suffering our whole life, if we're afraid of pain, if we're afraid of risks, then we're never going to do anything interesting, because those are the kind of fears that control systems use to keep people from stepping out of line, stepping out of their place, or challenging the authorities that may be keeping them down. So Crowley addresses this idea sort of profoundly in Liber 418, we have a very specific sort of idea of where the genesis of all this is, and he gets a vision of, or it's described to him about the four great devils, which are the perversions of religion. So in the sense we have error. So there's a sense that there is some kind of truth that's here, but it's being perverse, it's being corrupted, it's being misunderstood by the masses, and that's where these devils manifest. It says that they're worshipped as gods by men, so like Satan is worshipped as Jesus Christ on earth, for example. That is kind of like the idea of parody, the idea of distorting the religious idea or the core idea of the religion into something that's almost completely the opposite of what's initially intended. And Iwas, in the Book of the Law, tells Thelemites, sort of how to approach these different religious systems. This passage, it's chapter 3 from like verse 49 to 60, pretty much, where in Crowley's commentaries he explains this is like our method of religious studies, where he says, with my hawk's head, I peck out the eyes of Jesus where he hangs on the cross. And in Crowley's comments to that, for example, he says, this is because the point of view of Christianity, the point of view of self-sacrifice is wrong. And this is the idea that when I'm attacking Christianity, when I was attacking Christianity, this is the idea that is being attacked. And it talks about tearing up the flesh of the Hindu system, which he says, like the bones, the structure of it is sound, but we can keep the structure, but there's different elements that are attached onto it that are not necessary. So you strip it down to that, and so on and so forth. So that this idea of four great devils as parodies of these religions is really important to understanding that passage in the Book of the Law and into what it means to sort of look at these ideas in the concept of the new aeon. Like, if the new aeon is changing the magical currents, is changing the existence of how spiritual systems work, well, how is it changing them? And ideally, if we're trying to manifest that change, what are we going to do to promote that? Like, where are we going to approach it from? And Liberal sort of tells us, how to look at that idea. And this is really important because these are questions that everyone's going to have to grapple with at some point in time. Whatever our values are, they're going to be something that transgress against those values. I mean, a lot of people get into the occult, they come from a very Christian background, so initially what they're trying to do is overthrow that model in their minds and kind of like reject what has been put into their heads by the system that has brought them up, which is great. That's a good initial step. But then you get to another point where now you have a new set of values, and a new set of norms, and a new set of ideas. And you can stick with those, or you can continue to transgress, continue to challenge, say, okay, what makes me angry now? What offends me now that I no longer buy into this model? But there's always going to be, and this is the thing that I think that escapes people when they talk about transgressing their values or like the limitations of the systems that they were brought up in, is they don't see that the power in that act is not necessarily in coming up with the new idea, it's transgressing what the idea is. So it's a process. It's always taking place. There's no point at which it's over where suddenly you're like, okay, I got my new awesome values and here we are. Because accepting that essentially allows room to have the old system creep back in. And just for a very obvious example of this, I mean, we can see this in our culture now. We live in a very secular society. I personally, I don't know what people's experiences are in this room. I've always been very open about my occult practices and my occult stuff. I very rarely got in any trouble about that, largely because it is a secular society, and people are kind of like, well, if you want to have your kooky religious beliefs, go ahead. Like, we're all here to do what we're going to do. I personally have not experienced a great deal of anything that I consider real persecution in the likes of which someone might have seen 100 years ago or 200 years ago doing this kind of stuff. It's kind of a joke by comparison. And unfortunately, I think that this is a lot of what comes out when we look at people who are trying to challenge the norms, trying to challenge contemporary society, and instead all they end up doing is challenging values that were transgressed and sort of overthrown a long time ago. And it's not new to do this anymore. I mean, primetime TV is that level of edgy, of making fun of the church, for example. I mean, that's not exactly a new thing. It's not exactly, you're not hitting any buttons. Maybe someone's grandmother's going to be pissed off, but that's not the same thing at all. It's challenging our own values. But the funny thing about secular society, and Martin Heidegger points this out in his letter on humanism, which is very interesting, where he basically says humanism, secular humanism, is rewarmed Christianity. It follows all the same value systems, has the same idea of love thy neighbor, take care of each other, don't be an asshole, kind of stuff